Okay. Um, Thank you guys so much for joining us for this month's How I Got That Story. This is a event that Anne has done previously in the past for several years, and it's something that we only just revitalized in the last month or so. So the idea for the series is to take award-winning or impactful stories that AND members or AND journalists have done and to dissect them and have a conversation with the journalists themselves about the inception of the story, any sort of like details and barriers, and uh, details that they'd like to share about the story with the hopes that, you might be able to replicate this in your own newsroom or it'll provide insight for you or any of your reporters. So today we have Anna Kaminski and Winter Wagner here. They were both reporters for Eugene Weekly. They wrote a story called Crisis Mode, which won third place in last year's Anna Awards. And I'm going to put a link to the story here in the chat. Um, we would love for folks, hopefully you read it before coming, but we'll talk a little bit about it and you can read it afterwards if you haven't already. And it won third place in our solutions journalism category last year. So I'll let them sort of introduce themselves and then we will get into how the story came together. So whoever wants to go first.
I can go. Hi, my name is Winter Wagner. We were actually students at UO when we were doing all of this. I am a director of communications at a nonprofit in Portland, Oregon, focused on homelessness services, which kind of ties into the story itself. So yeah.
Yeah, I am Anna Kaminski. I am a journalist in Kansas. Like Winter said, we worked on this while we were students several years ago. So it's been an interesting revisitation of this time. And it's a very long story, so if you guys didn't get to the end of it, totally understand. But yeah, excited to talk to you guys.
Thank you both. So what I'll do is I'll read a brief description that summarizes the piece. Again, it won third place in our solutions journalism category. And then I'll also read the judge's comment that they left when they were deliberating on who to award the prizes to for last year's award. So here's a summary. So in crisis mode, a system meant to help people navigate crises was in the throes of a crisis of its own making. Centered on Lane County, Oregon, the story took a solutions-oriented approach in examining the pitfalls and challenges of the area's mental health system. Plans for a crisis center had stalled, emergency rooms were overflowing, and the local jail had become a default psych ward because there was nowhere else for people experiencing a mental health crisis to go. The story, originally published in 2023, looked toward Tucson, Arizona, examining their system's successes and limitations, and how Lane County could take inspiration and cease the practice of leaving people behind. So it was kind of a comparison and contrast, and Winter and Anna will talk about that. But looking at the mental health system and the barriers and complications of their own county and looking toward a more successful model in a different state and asking critical questions of, okay, how is it working in our county? Why is it working there and why is it not working here? And what lessons could be learned from there? And, what could we take here? And I think this story is really interesting because there's a very good chance that these dynamics and these issues are playing out in every one of our areas, right? So no matter what newsroom you're with, all across the county, there is a not only a mental health crisis, but potentially a substance use crisis. There's also probably an issue with folks who have mental health issues ending up in jails, right? So there's all of these intertwining issues playing out across the country and all of our communities. And this story is a good way to sort of dissect and allow readers to see, well, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening somewhere else, and maybe here are the solutions that we could bring to our own county. The judge's comment is, by pairing reporting on Lane County's mental health crisis response system with analysis of a more successful one in Tucson, Crisis Mode is a model of solutions-oriented journalism, an article that both highlights a system in need of improvement and points to pathways for bettering it. So again, that's the goal of solutions journalism is to see the pitfalls and the obstacles, but also to see the paths forward. So Winter and Anna, I would love to talk to you. You guys said that you were student journalists at Eugene Weekly. Tell me about your role there, and then tell me how you guys initially got into reporting out this story. Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so how it worked was that we were in this solutions journalism course at the University of Oregon with Brent Walth, and how that worked in that class is that you chose a story that you wanted to report on, and then oftentimes, if that story was tying into issues that were relevant to Lane County or Eugene Weekly would publish it if it got to the point where it was, publishable. And so we worked on it for a really long time. So we weren't actually reporters at Eugene Weekly itself, but we were a part of this program called like Catalyst Journalism Project. And it was like about solutions journalism at UO. And that was headed by Brent Walth and like one or two other teachers. And yeah, that's how that happened.
Yeah, and for context, like right now, the partnership with Eugene Weekly is even a solution in and of itself. So Eugene Weekly is kind of, as a lot of journalistic institutions has fallen kind of on tough times. And so the partnership between the Catalyst Journalism Project and Eugene Weekly has kind of strengthened in recent, like probably just in the past year. So where the weekly paper doesn't have enough resources to hire on full-time reporters, students in classes getting credit or sometimes getting paid wages fill those gaps and offer vital coverage to the community in Eugene.
Yeah, I mean that just gives me, I'm making a note here of maybe we can do a session for Anne of how universities are working with local papers to sort of fill that gap. Yeah, I love that model. So tell me about where the idea for this story came from. So you guys are doing this course. How did you end up on this specific topic?
Yeah, it actually is a bit of an anecdote for me. It happened in a fun but funky way. I was, yeah, we were in this journalism course, and we are on a term basis, so it's a 10-week course. So you have to move relatively fast. You don't have a lot of time to write these stories, and Brent Walth chose us to told us to pick a topic, and it wasn't the topic that I initially picked, but I had this experience where in the apartment complex that I was living in a few blocks away from campus, there was a Black man one night experiencing a really bad mental health episode, and he was walking in circles around the apartment complex, screaming very loudly. And I was worried for him, so I called on emergency and I requested that they send Cahoots. And I don't know if you guys know what Cahoots is, but it's a alternative police response in Eugene that's very renowned for what they do. And they're very limited in their resources. So that's not like they can, answer every call. And they told me on non-emergency that they would send someone to check on him. And not even a few minutes later, several police SUVs pull up and these police officers get out decked in gear and the lights are flashing and they put him in handcuffs and put him in the back of one of those vans or one of those SUVs. And I can just like see him rocking back and forth as he's driven off. And I was incredibly worried what was going to happen to him. And I wrote about this for an in-class activity that we were doing for the solutions class. And Brent, after reading it, sat me down one-on-one, and he was like, "This is a really relevant issue in Eugene," and he was explaining it to me, and he told me the importance of it and that it's something that needs to be more talked about. And he highly encouraged me to go down that route. So I did. And in the midst of all of this, he was also encouraging people like Anna to pursue that avenue as well. And so, yeah, that's how we both got working on it almost like separately.
Mm-hmm. And now we didn't know each other before, and now Winter and I are lifelong friends, so that's great.
Yes. Yeah.
Mine was a little bit different. I had heard, well, also in this class, I had heard about this instance that happened in Eugene where a man who was experiencing, I believe it was a drug-induced mental health crisis. That was all kind of a tandem of things. And because there was nowhere else to take him, he was taken to jail. His family was worried about him. They had called the police. And so police came and picked him up and took him to the jail in Lane County, which I was actually able to tour as a part of this story. Um, and police ended up killing him in the bay of the jail. That had been written about before Winter and I's time, but in learning about that, in reading about it, it kind of drew up all these questions of what has changed since then. What is different now in this community that can prevent this kind of thing than what was previously? And we found almost nothing is different. And in fact, today, which we could talk about a little bit later, things are arguably possibly worse because things still have not changed.
Yeah. That leads me to my next question is, so you found an issue, right? A lot of times our stories come from things that are going wrong. But you are taking the solutions journalism class, so obviously it has to be solutions journalism framed. So how did you go about implementing the solutions journalism framework for this story? I'm assuming that's where the Tucson model comes in. But walk me through how you guys identified Tucson as sort of like the goalpost, and how you implemented the solutions journalism framework to reporting out the story. And if you'll briefly sort of explain what solutions journalism is for maybe folks who don't know.
Yeah, solutions journalism is, as it sounds, it's journalism about solutions. It's an extension of investigative reporting. So rather than reporting on the problem itself, like the crisis system, you report on the solutions, like crisis systems that are doing a good job. And how we landed on Tucson, it was at first a lot of it was research on different areas in the country and how they were doing with their crisis systems. Denver, Colorado is another example of a place that's doing pretty well in terms of their crisis system. But then the reason why Tucson, we had an emphasis on it was because the Lane County government who was planning the crisis center. They're trying to open a crisis center in Eugene, and this is Anna's topic, but my topic was Tucson, and we were taking it. We knew that they were taking inspiration from Tucson, and so we didn't know where in Tucson. We didn't know what the name of the crisis center was, but we knew that that was what they were looking to as inspiration for what they were doing, trying to do in Eugene. So that is why we pursued it. And yeah, for us, it was just about finding crisis systems that were succeeding versus not in Lane County.
Yeah, and we picked out Tucson again, Winter, and both of us had done, mostly Winter though, had done a lot of research around the country of what was working, who was doing things better. And then through public records requests in Oregon and Eugene and Lane County, we discovered the interest in Tucson. And that was a whole nother issue, an expensive issue to go through the public records requests. But that gave us some insight into what the county public health department was thinking, or excuse me, behavioral health department. And then applying the solutions journalism framework, we went through a lot of iterations. So we started reporting on this, I think, in 2021. I believe was when we started, and
That
we
was
went
my second
through
class, yeah.
drafts, yeah, drafts and drafts and drafts, and put the solutions framework, like sometimes up on a whiteboard, sometimes up on a document, and plugged things in to ensure that it fit that structure. Because when you apply that structure, I think the product, like Winter mentioned, is an extension of investigative journalism. You get an accountability piece, but then you get some sort of an answer. So, under the Solutions Journalism Network, the four tenets of solutions journalism are a response. So, is a solution addressing a social problem. It's insight. What is the accessibility and relevancy of a solution? And then evidence. What are the results that the solution produces? And then the limitations that exist within the solution. And that's a big piece of the accountability as well. We expand that a little bit. And I would have to go back and look at my notes to remember exactly how we expanded it. And again, the story is very long. So we kind of drew each of those categories out. And I think probably had a total of six, which included, are there people who are supportive of the solution? Are there people who are critical of the solution? Is there a completely different one that compares to this solution? So it was a lot of, I think, awareness as we were doing the reporting, but then a constant examination as we were going through the writing and editing process.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, you touched on this a little bit because you're looking not a lot of times when we're working on a story, we'll look at one system and say what's working or what's not working with the one system. But because you were comparing and contrasting two, I imagine it was a lot, like you said, of public records requests, a lot of talking to different people of multiple different departments across state lines, right? Um, you already mentioned a little bit about how the public records request got really expensive. What are some of the other obstacles that you ran into as you were reporting out this story?
Yeah, um, working with government was hard, shocker. It was tricky, I think, to get those records. It was tricky to get people to talk. It was tricky to get people to stick to what they were saying. But to address that comes persistence, sometimes charm, and then sometimes revisiting people way later, and sometimes a little bit of luck. Um, I think another one of the challenges came during the process was when I was looking at the solution in isolation. While solutions journalism is a guide, it's not necessarily a crutch. It works best when it's used in tandem with that investigative reporting, with narrative writing more often than not. A lot of editing, a lot of rewriting, and more editing. Um, but I think the framework that solutions journalism provided for this story, it worked best when it acknowledged the greater landscape in which the solution existed. And sometimes that was looking at Tucson and acknowledging all the pitfalls and challenges that they went through in order to get to the solution that we were looking at. So, and I think that's also what sets these kinds of stories apart is getting into all those details. And I will mention too, like I don't think a solution story has to be a big long thing. The past 2 years I spent writing for a daily paper and I applied a solutions framework in daily stories that took, no more than a couple of hours. So it can be accessible as involved as it sounds.
Was there anything that you wanted to add to that, Winter?
Yeah, I think, yeah, the way, as Anna was saying it, she dealt with a lot of the local government stuff, and I was tasked with tracking down people in across state lines. And for me, I think the challenge was finding Dr. Margie Balfour because she was this like almost this entity in Tucson that was like renowned for the crisis work that she was doing, and you have absolutely no idea what the best way to contact that person is. And I felt like I kept hitting a wall when I came to finding the right source in Tucson. And it just happened that I emailed the right person. And without me even mentioning Dr. Balfour's name, they were like, I'm going to connect you to Dr. Balfour because I think she'd be a great resource for you. And everything kind of just fell into place after that. So yeah, a lot of the challenges for me was just like finding the right people in different places to talk to. And, it's like one thing when you're in a city that you understand a little bit. It's another when you're researching a place you've never even been to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. We love when you reach out to a source and they're like, we'll connect you to this other source. And you're like, perfect.
yeah, like thank you so much.
Love
Yes.
that. Love that. As we go along in the conversation, if folks have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll address them as we go, or we'll address them at the end when we can. Um, as you look back, again, this reporting you did, like maybe 4 years ago, the story was published 2 years ago. Looking back and maybe right afterwards, what are some of the lessons that you learned from reporting out this story? And maybe how have you taken those lessons, further into your career 2 years out?
Yeah, my one of the things that has stuck with me the most and that I still carry with me today is that it's okay to be annoying. I think I was when I was a senior in college and we were doing the story, I was so afraid of being an annoying kid to these people. And I like you'd get advice from all of your journalism professors, and they're talking about the persistence that they have and that they want you to have. And I was like, I can never do that. That's insane. And now today I'm like, oh, I should have not been as afraid to be annoying because sometimes I was, and it got me the information that I needed. And so I definitely carry that with me today, where obviously you don't want to be, unprofessional, but it's okay to be persistent and it's okay to, be a little relentless, and it has no reflection on it, your character or anything like that. And yeah, that was a lesson that I learned that I still carry with me today.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything in particular I would do differently. I think always I look back at things and there's always things I would do differently that are much more, I suppose, personal gripes than anything. But I think ultimately this whole story and this whole experience shaped who I am as a journalist. The questions I ask as a part of, or I asked as a part of solutions journalism are still questions I use today. I think evaluating the limitations of any real or potential solution are incredibly valuable, and going beyond a source's typical top talking points, building trust with people so that they feel comfortable talking to you about difficult things. Those are all things that I took from this experience and really built during reporting out this story, which again have stuck with me today, and my career. I I think Winter did a lot of work looking at some more local solutions that didn't necessarily have a big piece of this story. And I think I would have personally liked to have seen that a little bit more, because I think it's a bit easier to compare a town over the mountains to one on the other side rather than a town in the Pacific Northwest to one in the Southwest. I don't think that hindered the story by any means, but I think there's something to be gained from the kind of the local interplay in my opinion.
Yeah. Um, we have a question in the chat that actually I was going to ask. So thank you, Chris. You had mentioned, Anna, that doing this story has shaped how you ask questions, especially particularly ones revolving around solutions journalism. So what questions did you learn to ask um, in your career now?
Yeah, and if Winter, if you remember any more, please feel free to jump in. But one of the big ones is like, who is doing things better, or what went wrong here, or what were the challenges here that you were able to address, and how do you take that with you in the future? What is something that people never ask you about related to this that you wish they would? Trying to think of another one. Those are like the big three that I'll use a lot in my reporting, particularly that who's doing things better one. Sometimes people can have a bit of an adverse reaction to it because I think there's a bit of an insinuation that they're not doing well. Um, However, I think it's the way it's asked and possibly rephrasing it a little bit of who do you look to for inspiration? Um, what examples do you keep an eye on in your work?
Um, you both already touched on this a little bit in terms of how it's impacted you and the way you think about journalism and the way you approach stories now. What other impacts did doing this story have on your life, either personally or in your professional life? I find that when I do like big stories like this, they sit with me for a long time and they do sort of shift my worldview by a couple degrees. So I'm wondering how that has shown up for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually was working for this nonprofit when I was reporting on this story, and I was relatively new to the organization, and pretty part-time, but this nonprofit from the start has been focused on homelessness services. And so that was something that I already felt pretty passionate about. And reporting on this story, I learned a lot about the ways that the crisis system impacts people who are unhoused, and how the most common demographic oftentimes for crisis care are people who are unhoused. And that's something that I still carry with me today. Just thinking about, the how there's so many different systems that have failed these people, and it's more complicated than you think it is, and it's like every which way you turn, there's something that's impacting them, and making it harder for them to get the care that they need. And so having it, like, while I was already in this line of work, doing this story helped me understand it a lot more than I already was starting to. And it's something that's still on the mind when I do this work today.
Yeah, this is probably going to sound dramatic, but I feel like this story kind of saved my relationship with journalism in a way. Um, Finding out how to do journalism in a way that I think is productive can be sometimes difficult. This solutions approach, I think, really reignited something in me. I've been writing for publication since I was 16. I've always known I wanted to be a journalist. I was writing this story when I was 21. I'm now in my mid 20s and I'm still a journalist. And I think without this experience, I don't know that I would be. Um, as long and arduous as the process was, it was incredibly, incredibly valuable to be able to get to work with Winter, a colleague who equally has passion for this as I do, and to be able to work with our mentor, who guided us in all these interesting ways, I think really left quite an impact on my life personally as well as professionally. Um, and I think too, it also taught me how to use my passions and the things that I'm interested in and things like empathy and curiosity in really useful ways. I think often we can see those things as human weaknesses or maybe let them get in the way of things, but in this story, I was able to use all those different things and also learn how to hone them in order to continue writing about topics like these. So, following this, and still today, I write a lot about homelessness, mental health, and behavioral health, and along with substance abuse or substance use, and the systems at play, because often a lot of those things can be really interconnected. So, I think again, okay, it sounds dramatic, but it left a pretty big impact on my life.
I love to hear that because, we often think about the impact that stories have on the people that are either in the stories or on the direct community, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think that there's not as much conversation about how stories that we do impact the reporters who are reporting out the stories, either in a positive way or a negative way. But yeah, I would like to ask, you foreshadowed a little bit already earlier on that things maybe worse than they were 3 years ago when you guys, or 2 years ago when you did this story. Tell me about the impact that this story had on the community, the county, the city, on city officials, on the folks who were coming up with this idea for the crisis center, that you can share now.
Yeah, I think so. At the time, this wasn't well known about, so it definitely brought it to the public consciousness. And I think it also prompted officials to be more transparent in their communications and their plans about this kind of thing. After we had published this story, they started publicizing their work. And they created a newsletter list and spoke with several other media outlets to talk about this. Um, Often subverting, I think, the accountability piece. But I think also another piece of this is a sheriff's candidate had pulled out a quote from this story and used it in his campaign. Um, Someone who was trying to strip away funding from the jail and kind of was the antithesis to the story that we were writing about. And we had a very strong editor at Eugene Weekly. She's still there, and she called that candidate out for it. Um, as I said at the top of this call, is arguably things might be worse. I think that I say that for a couple of reasons. There was an existing crisis center in Eugene that shuttered its doors, I think, within the past year. So what few resources this community had, it's now just gone. I think too, with this behavioral health stabilization center that we wrote about, or this planned behavioral health stabilization center, the timeline has not changed. When we were first writing about this for like 3 to 4 years ago, they were saying, oh, we will have this built in 2 to 3 years. The last update I received on this was in October, and it was the same exact timeline. Obviously, many things come into play with a project this large: funding, bureaucracy, collaboration, all these different things. Um, but unfortunately, the delays and the obfuscation of accountability are still present. And I think why I mentioned that partnership between Eugene Weekly and the students at the University of Oregon is they're I think one of the main drivers of accountability journalism in the Eugene community. They have a daily paper there that has kind of just been stripped of itself. And so I think that plays into it as well. When you have fewer people watching, I think officials can get away with a little bit more. So It's all not doom and gloom, though. Ideally, this project will still happen, and there are people on the ground doing incredible things to fill these gaps. And I believe last year, Lane County, they requested funding from the legislature, and I'm not sure if they're intending to do the same again this year, but they're slowly building up a funding base to be able to get this off the ground.
Okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, the timeline is still 2 to 3 years out, even though that's what they were saying 4 years ago. Okay,
Yeah.
I see.
Yep.
I see that we have a couple questions in the chat. I have a few more questions to ask you guys, and then I'll circle back to the questions in the chat. But Todd has also mentioned that we record these conversations and we have them in Anne's um, Google folder. So if you want to be able to access this conversation, our past conversation from, I think, 2 months ago, which is also a fantastic conversation. That one involved in a police shooting, unfortunately. Similar kind of topic in terms of like mental health issues. That one should also be in there. And then any future conversations for how I got this story will also be in this folder. Um, we've already mentioned touched on this a little bit, but what do you want people to sort of take away from this story and know about the topics that you touched on in the story?
Yeah, crisis response and crisis care are two separate elements of a very large wheel, and both are essential and needed, but there is this whole other system at play, and that's something that Anna touched upon a little bit. There's the interconnectedness of a lot of these issues. And as I was mentioning previously, like the people who are unhoused are some of the largest demographic that these crisis systems are serving. And for some, most of what they need is a warm place to rest, some food, clean clothes, a shower, and living on the streets is their crisis. And you cannot address the crisis system without addressing elements such as homelessness. And it reminded me, thinking about this, of the man that I spoke with in Denver, Colorado. Is he also mentioned that he described it as synergy. It's about all the different elements coming together, and that is how you succeed in the crisis system. If you're just addressing one or two elements of it, Eugene's a good example of this because Eugene has a really great crisis response system with Cahoots, but there's nowhere for them to go after Cahoots response to them. And that is a flaw in the system that is impacting the city negatively. So I guess I would hope that people would, take away from the story that the system as a whole is what matters, and that requires attention to every little element that's within it.
I concur. I have nothing to add there. Agree.
And then lastly, how can other reporters or other newsrooms, write stories similar to this or replicate, and take this issue and do a story like this in their own newsroom? What tips would you have for them?
If you're interested in writing about a story like this and don't know a lot about solutions journalism, I'd really encourage you to look at the Solutions Journalism Network. They're available at solutionsjournalism.org, and they provide a lot of training and guidance on how to write solution stories. Again, I encourage anybody to take it with a grain of salt because I think these can all look different. Like I said at the beginning, it's not necessary to write this massive years-long endeavor in order to create a valid solution story. You can do it in a day if you meet some key elements. Um, I think having a good sense of what the community cares about helps a lot in these instances. It helps identify the stories you can write. It helps identify who you can talk to. It helps identify what solutions are doing, if they're working or not working. And I think something I learned from this, I think both Winter and we talked to way more people than who were included in this story. Um, so we kind of drew a massive circle around this issue and really only kind of wrote about just this tiny inner circle. So I think taking those big leaps is important too to get a full understanding. And then something I liked about this as well is, again, we were college students and we took this massive swing, writing about not only issues locally, but something that is occurring I don't know how many hundreds of miles away in Arizona. So I think don't be afraid to take a big swing as well. If you can do the reporting to make it connect, then it's valid in my opinion.
Yeah, I think everything that Anna said, and also just reiterating that small sources can be, they can give you the best quotes, that they can lead you to the next source that you desperately need for your story. Don't be afraid of the little things that seem like they're not as relevant to your story. You never know where it's going to lead. Yeah, otherwise, everything Anna said, it's just.
Well, that actually dovetails nicely with Chris's question in the chat. So I'll pose hers first. She asked, with the story this long and involved, often there's angles that come up that you don't end up pursuing, right? So did anything end up on the cutting room floor that you ended up pursuing for another story, or that you sort of have in the back of your mind that you might, pursue in some form or another in the future?
Yeah, I really like talking to the people in Arizona. You would hear a lot of really, really sweet stories about like things that had happened that weren't as extreme. I think there was a thing where a woman who had been coming to that crisis center for quite a while, like ended up teaching like a yoga class there, and it was just like really sweet to see, how that crisis center positively impacted her and then helped her impact other people. And that did not end up in the story. And also just like the other places we talked to, Denver, I feel like it was one of the first major crisis systems that I delved into when I was initially researching it for this story in our class. And hearing about what they were doing, I thought it was like incredibly, inspiring. And I felt like, they were another good example of a system that was succeeding. And obviously, I'd have to look again today to see how it's doing currently. But because we were so focused on Tucson, that was what ended up being the heart of the story. And if I had it my way, we would have included a little bit of, Denver, but the story was just too long.
Yeah, I think the big one that jumps out to me, I know there were a couple, but the big one that jumps out to me was I spoke and interviewed several times a woman and her daughter who lived in Eugene, and they both had experience kind of with the crisis system. The daughter had a series of mental health issues, and I think was institutionalized a couple of times before they had moved to Eugene, and then because there was no other options for her, she was institutionalized again while in Eugene because she didn't have somewhere, for instance, like a crisis center to go for temporary respite. Um, and the whole swath of other issues kind of tumbled out of that. Um, and I think the reason we didn't include it is as important as their story was. I think I wrote up a little bit of it to include as a sidebar. I mean, I don't think they even ended up including that. I think it kind of goes down another rabbit hole and detracted, as harsh as this may sound, it detracted from the main issue that we were focusing on. Addressing institutionalization would have been a whole another several thousand word long story. But I've kept in contact with her, and if I still lived in Eugene, and if I lived in Eugene immediately following this story, that's certainly something I would do. This is something I do in my day to day is from stories come stories, and especially when reporting on this kind of thing. Because if you ask somebody, oh, who do you know who's experienced this kind of thing? Who else should I be talking to? You will get story ideas in an instant. So I've been reporting on the opioid crisis recently and how federal settlement funds have trickled throughout the state of Kansas where I report. And from that process, I talked to a bajillion people for one story and couldn't even get to all of them. And they all passed me along to other people. So I think it's definitely worth holding on to those that you don't use in one story. I had an editor who always used to say, why write one story when you can write two? So
Yeah. Yeah, it's a never-ending loop and cycle. I think it's like you're reporting one, you're like, oh wow, this is a great idea for another story, and you just have to put it on your list of ideas. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm working through them, or you can raise your hand in the Zoom. Jimmy asks, as students, what kind of guidance did you get on the story from your professors and or editors?
So much. We would not have been able to write this story without the mentorship that we received both from Brent Walth and from the editor-in-chief at Eugene Weekly, Camilla. Brent was like, when I was talking about how I was like afraid of being annoying, and Brent was the person that was just like behind me, just pushing me, just like go on, go forth, be as insistent as you need to be. He was making phone calls for me sometimes when I was too scared to do it myself. Yeah, no, he was incredibly instrumental to ensuring the success of this story. And I feel like I didn't pursue journalism after college. I immediately went in full time into the nonprofit sector. But I feel like if I had decided to pursue it, and even then, still today, there are elements of his mentorship that I still carry with me. But yeah, I think he like would have absolutely helped shape my role as a journalist and did in my time there.
Yeah, and like we had mentioned, this started off in a college course and extended beyond there. As a part of the course, we had to meet with the professor who was our mentor and editor throughout this. We had to meet with him as a requirement of the project we were working on. This extended way beyond that. And we met with him. We met as a group really regularly. And like we would sketch out an outline of the story on a whiteboard and we would just talk things through. We would cross things out, add things on it. Probably looked insane a little bit if you were just looking out from in or from out in. But I think having that collaborative sense and that level of attention and care applied to detail and nuance was really beneficial. Structurally, we had multiple drafts. So I think that would just look like Winter and I writing separately, putting something together, and then editing, and then doing the same thing all over again. Or doing that, going out doing more reporting and then doing it all over again. And I think that was also, as frustrating as it was also really, really helpful to have that structure and that iterative process of getting this right.
I think we have one more question in the chat, which I love, from Cool or Cool. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. How do the stories you work on impact you personally? We talked a little bit about that, but I guess broadly. And how do you manage the emotional weight of the work, especially moving from one story to another? Do you have strategies for disconnecting, or is that even necessary or possible?
Uh, yeah, this is something that ties in really well to the work that I do today. Disconnecting is essential. It's not always easy. I think especially with the current political landscape, but it can feel really disheartening to see it if there's like progress being made, having that progress kind of snatched back. I love to, this is like sounds so silly. I love to like, accidentally leave my phone in the other room and like cook a really long, in-depth meal. And like that's kind of how I do a lot of disconnecting in the evening time when you just need to be with yourself and some food. It's a therapeutic and it also kind of just like reminds you of the importance of nourishing yourself if you're going to be able to help other people. You have to make sure that your health is in a good place. But it's everything definitely weighs on you pretty heavily and it doesn't really stop.
Yeah, this has been on my mind a lot this week. From Wednesday night into last night, I was reporting on the plane crash that happened in DC that originated in Kansas. So I've been thinking a lot about how to like work that, especially because it was kind of 24 hours straight of death and doom and despair. And I don't have it all figured out, but to answer the question is the stories, again, like I said earlier, I think to remove your humanity from the stories you write on does you and your audience a great disservice. I think approaching things from a perspective of or from a place of curiosity and empathy has served me really, really well. And moving from one story to another in the moment, as probably terrible as it sounds, it just looks like compartmentalization, but I always try to return um, to any complicated feelings that I might have. I've yet to do that with the Wichita plane crash, but I will. And I think in terms of disconnecting, I agree with Winters. I do think it's essential. Like I said, I'm still figuring out what that looks like for me as I grow in my reporting career. And it's come up many, many times in the past couple of years of how to disconnect from really tough, traumatic stories. Sometimes that looks like going on a run or a hike, or like Winter said, making yourself a nice meal, spend time with loved ones. Doing kind things for yourself, I think, helps. But again, I'm not a licensed professional. I don't have it all figured out, but I say do what works for you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. We're gonna wrap up here. This has been such an awesome conversation. I'm so heartened also to see young folks either in journalism or continuing to do similar work and communication. So I would love for you to share a little bit about what you're doing now, and if you have places where people can continue to follow your work or get to know the organization that you work for. I would love for you to talk a little bit about those and maybe throw them in the chat, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes. I will after I can't focus on two things. I will share the link to the Instagram and to the website. Yeah, I am the director of communications for a nonprofit in Portland, Oregon called Our Streets. It's, as I've said previously, focused on homelessness services, primarily food, and we do a lot of food provision for the shelters that are in the Portland metro area. So it's a daily operation, and lots of focus on nutrition and that kind of stuff. And I've been there since its origin in 2020, and so we're about to be 5 years old, starting in June. And yeah, I'll share a link to the website and to the Instagram. I think we do a lot of educational stuff as well on social media, because there's a lot of issues that we care about and not as many issues that we can, do our own work on. So we like to raise awareness about them when possible. And I do just recommend getting in touch or like getting in tune with what's happening within your own city. As said at the beginning of this, because there are crisis systems within your own city, and there are, there's a lack of, or lack thereof, and there's homelessness services or a lack thereof, and it's all tied together. And it really helps to understand where it's succeeding and where it could use some more help. You would be surprised at how little effort it takes to contribute to the system positively, if you just look in the right places. So I highly encourage doing that.
Agree. I am currently writing for a digital publication called Kansas Reflector. It's part of the state's newsroom network, which is a nonprofit news organization based in North Carolina, but with, I think, like 30 something outlets across the country. So I report on local government, politics, pretty much anything that touches that, which allows me to travel across the state and write about a variety of issues. Before that, I was living in Oregon, working for a daily paper, writing about crime, public safety, and local government. But if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk. If you have a local state's newsroom outlet in your state, I would encourage you to check their work out. They're all really, really great journalists. I also included my Blue Sky and the message. I just downloaded it this week, so I don't know if I wrote my handle down, so I apologize for that if it's incorrect. But yeah, I am really grateful to be here today and talk to you guys about this. You guys asked incredible questions, so thank you for being a great group.
Thank you guys. I'm also putting let's see, my name.
Thank you, Tara.
I'm putting my personal email in there. I'm currently sitting in two seats-ish. I'm sitting in the diversity and editorial chair for Anne. So I'm helping put down some of this editorial programming, like the How I Got that story series. I also have, again, stories beget more stories, ideas beget more ideas. So from this, I would love to do some kind of session where we talk to universities and papers that have worked with universities to do and fill reporting gaps. I think that's an interesting model that we probably all could use. So, if you have questions or ideas that we can do for more online events like this as part of and programming, you guys pay for your membership. We want to do things that work for you and are interesting to you, please feel free to email me. We'll do another one of these, How I Got That Story, next month, probably towards the end of February. So keep a lookout in your inbox. Todd will be sending out more information about that. And yeah, just please send us more information and ideas. We always love to hear from folks, and we want to do as an organization what we can to help our members. So with that, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Winter, so much. Great reporting.
Sayaka, Sayaka, it's Pearl
Yeah,
from St. Paul's. I just
hi.
want to make a hi, want to make a plug. We have a full-time reporters opening here. So if anybody's looking or knows of somebody looking, City Pulse is a 24-year-old alt weekly in Lansing, Michigan. You might need a shovel right now, but it's beautiful here, summer and fall and spring. So let me know. I posted my email address and phone number in the chat, and I'm happy to talk to anyone. Thank you.
Okay, we love that. Thanks, Pearl. Okay, well, thank you guys all so much. Keep a lookout in your inboxes for the next one next month, and we appreciate you all for joining. Thank you, Winter and Anna. Bye.